The land that God promises to Israel in the Old Testament is called Canaan, and the books of Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Joshua refer to numerous nations that occupied this land prior to Israel's arrival. 7 of them are singled out in particular as a stereotyped list. These are the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Of these nations, it is the Canaanites who appear most prominently as the rivals of Israel. And yet, it's hard to get a sense from the Bible alone of who they were, where they lived, where they came from, and what happened to them. They exist in the story purely as a foil for Israel, as a faceless enemy that must be driven from the land promised to Yahweh's people. However, the Canaanites were also real people, and they have their own story to tell. A story revealed through over a century of painstaking research and fortuitous discoveries by archaeologists. Let's examine the Canaanites of history and compare them to the text of the Bible to see what its authors meant by their use of the label Canaanite. The origins of the word Canaan are a mystery, and we have no direct evidence of any pre-Israelite people ever calling themselves Canaanites. The earliest reliable mention of them in the historical record is in a letter to the king of Mari, a Bronze Age Syrian city-state. Dated to the 18th century BCE, it warns of the brigands and Kinanu, the Akkadian name for Canaanites, who occupy a town called Rahisum. The location of Rahisum remains a mystery. However, it is mainly during the late Bronze Age, a few centuries later, that the name Canaan starts to appear in documents from Ugarit, Alalak, and Egypt as a name for the Western Levant. Throughout the Bronze Age, the Levant was inhabited by West Semitic tribes who were distantly related to the Akkadian-speaking people of Mesopotamia. Their lifestyle was a mix of pastoralism and sedentary agriculture that went through cycles based on the climate and economic conditions of the region. Canaan was also a crossroads for trade, and the regional powers of the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Egyptians constantly vied for influence in the region. During the Middle Bronze Age, the Egyptians considered the Levant to be part of their sphere of influence, and several pharaohs conducted raids from which they brought back slaves and booty. The tables were turned in 1650 BCE when a Canaanite king conquered the eastern Nile Delta and established a dynasty of Canaanite pharaohs, often called the Hyksos by modern historians. These Canaanites ruled most of Egypt for about 100 years until Pharaoh Amosa kicked them out at the start of the late Bronze Age. Controlling the Levant now became a priority for the Egyptians. A series of campaigns by 18th dynasty pharaohs culminated in a major defeat of a Canaanite coalition at Megiddo by Pharaoh Thutmose III. Canaan officially became a province of Egypt, and Egyptian administrative centers were established at several key locations: Gaza, Jaffa, and Beth Shean. In addition to keeping garrisons in Canaan, the Egyptian pharaohs regularly exchanged letters with local Canaanite kings. Hundreds of such letters, written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets, have been discovered by archaeologists in the abandoned royal city of Amarna. Known as the Amarna letters, they are an invaluable treasure trove of information on Canaan during that time. From them, we know that Canaan was organized according to a city-state hinterland model. By comparing the letters with archaeological evidence, historians have determined that there were around 15 city-states. Each one had its own territory with smaller towns and agricultural estates that it governed on behalf of the Egyptians. The most notable Canaanite individual during this period was Labayu, an ambitious king of Shechem who began expanding his own territory at the expense of other city-states. A few Canaanite kings joined Labayu, while others formed an alliance to oppose him. These rivalries persisted even after Labayu's exile and assassination, with only Egyptian hegemony and soldiers keeping the peace. The Canaanite socioeconomic system came to an end in the final decades of the Bronze Age, an event known as the Bronze Age collapse. Severe droughts across the eastern Mediterranean caused entire civilizations to collapse and brought large-scale migrations of people to the Near East, including the Philistines, who invaded the coastal regions of Canaan. Most Canaanite urban centers collapsed, and Egypt's hold on the region began to weaken. Sometime between 1140 and 1130, the Egyptian presence in Canaan ended. The withdrawal of Egypt and breakup of the Bronze Age city-state system caused new alliances to form along ethnic lines. These emerging Canaanite polities included the Phoenicians along the northern coast, Samaria in the central highlands, Judah in the southern highlands, and Ammon, Gilead, and Moab in the Transjordan region, as well as the non-Canaanite Philistine kingdoms. Now that the Egyptian province of Canaan no longer existed, the name Canaan itself fell into disuse. In later times, we find it mainly associated with the cities of Phoenicia. An example can be found in Matthew 15:22, which refers to a Phoenician woman as a Canaanite. The Phoenicians were renowned traders and seafarers, and that connection influenced how the term Canaanite was understood by some Hebrew writers. The Bronze Age Canaanites spoke a Northwest Semitic language that was similar to what their neighbors in Ugarit and Syria spoke. Their efforts at written language were limited mainly to the diplomatic letters they sent to Egypt. These are produced using the Akkadian cuneiform writing system in a language that was an artificial hybrid of Canaanite and Akkadian. The Bronze Age Canaanites did not write in their native language and produced no writing for expressive purposes, as far as we can tell. They wrote no history, no stories, and no law codes. Historian Seth Sanders writes, "By contrast with the abundant Amarna letters, brimming with language and politics, we are hard-pressed to find a single complete sentence in the alphabetic texts of late Bronze Age Canaan." In much the same way that Latin evolved over the centuries and diverged into separate regional languages, like Italian, Spanish, and French, Canaanite also continued to evolve and diverge into new dialects. Around 900 BCE, roughly 3 centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the royal courts of Canaan began experimenting with literary expression in their own dialects, Phoenician, Hebrew, Moabite, and Aramaic, using a new Canaanite alphabet that had recently been standardized by the scribal artisans of the Phoenician cities. This development coincided with the emergence of Hebrew as a distinct language and a scribal culture that could produce literature in that language. Canaanite religion consisted of both rural and urban cultic sites. Rural sites were often open-air shrines with sacred stones called massabot. This practice dates back as far as the Neolithic Age. From the Middle Bronze onward, temples were constructed in practically all cities for the purpose of social control by the elite. A fairly consistent pantheon of gods was venerated throughout Syria and Canaan, and a great deal of literature about their religion and mythology has been preserved at sites like Ugarit to the north. The chief god and head of the assembly of gods was called El. His consort was Asherah, sometimes also called Elat, the feminine form of El. The goddesses Ashtart and Anat, and the gods Baal, Hadad, Dagon, and Reshep were especially popular throughout Canaan. Even the Egyptians had adopted some of these gods during the brief period of Hyksos rule. The Iron Age also saw the rise of local patron deities who were closely associated with specific kings and royal dynasties. The emphasis on national deities, such as Chemosh in Moab and Milcom in Ammon, played a significant role in state formation and identity during this time. Now that we have a rough picture of who the Canaanites were, how does that stack up with their biblical representation? Old Testament references to Canaan fall broadly into 2 groups. In the historical books, Canaan is simply the land between the coast and the Jordan River that has been promised by God to the Israelites. Canaanite in these passages is used as an ethnic term, but a vague one, and it is universally negative. The Canaanites and their land are not allowed by the biblical history writers to depart from their fixed rules in the narrative, writes renowned Old Testament scholar Niels Peter Lemke. Nowhere in these passages can we find any genuine cultural memory of Bronze Age Canaan. The political system of Canaanite city-states, controlled by Egypt, is entirely absent from the stories of the Pentateuch, Joshua, and Judges that are ostensibly set in the Bronze Age. The prophetic and poetic books, on the other hand, treat the Canaanites with more nuance. They often connect the term Canaanite with the Phoenicians and use it as a synonym for merchant or trader. For example, Isaiah 23:11 explicitly equates Canaan with the Phoenician city-state of Tyre. Hosea 12:7-8 compares Ephraim, that is, Israel, with a trader/Canaanite who cheats his customers. Ezekiel 17:4 describes Israel as being replanted in a land of Canaanites, i.e. traders, during the Babylonian exile. And Zechariah 14:21 declares that one day, no longer will any Canaanite be seen in the house of Yahweh Sabaoth. It's hard to tell which meaning of Canaanite is intended in this last instance, maybe both. Isaiah 19:18 delivers a remarkable oracle predicting the allegiance of 5 Egyptian cities to Yahweh, stating that in that day the Egyptians will speak the language of Canaan. Whether this language is supposed to be Hebrew, Aramaic, or Phoenician is debated by scholars, but the oracle is undeniably post-exilic and views the word Canaan as neutral without any negative connotations. Another passage that seems to subvert the negative connotations of Canaanite is Ezekiel 16:3, which states, "Tell Jerusalem that these are the words of Yahweh the Lord to her. Canaan is the land of your ancestry and your birthplace. Your father was an Amorite, your mother a Hittite." In short, the way the Old Testament authors view the Canaanites depends more on the rhetorical needs of the text than any specific historical situation. Archaeology has revealed what for many people is an uncomfortable truth. The historical land of Canaan was not conquered by the Israelites as outside invaders. The earliest known reference to Israel comes from the Merneptah Stela, which mentions Israel as a Canaanite tribe subdued by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah during a military campaign toward the end of the Bronze Age. The use of the people determinative implies that Israel is an ethnic group but not a nation. A few centuries later, an Israelite kingdom emerged in the highlands of Samaria in northern Canaan, speaking its own Canaanite dialect, which eventually became the Hebrew language, and practicing its own version of Canaanite religion. In the Bible, the God of Israel is known as El, the same supreme God worshipped by Israel's Canaanite predecessors. Even the name Israel itself is a theophoric name that refers to the god El. The tradition in Deuteronomy 32:8 stating that the nations were divided according to the number of the sons of El comes from the same Canaanite traditions preserved in Ugarit, where El is the father of the other gods. The frequent depiction of El and other gods as bulls at Ugarit, Tyre, and Hazor is echoed in the golden calf idols of Jeroboam and Aaron and the bulls in the Jerusalem temple, as well as several divine titles in the Bible. The biblical epithet Ancient of Days recalls El's Ugaritic epithet Father of Years, which describes his status as the oldest of the gods. Other Canaanite deities, including Asherah, Anat, Baal, Dagon, and Reshep, also appear in the Bible. 2 Kings 23 tells us that Asherah and Baal were venerated alongside Yahweh in the Jerusalem temple. Several passages depict the god Reshep, often associated with pestilence, as part of Yahweh's retinue. Famous inscriptions from Kuntalet Adrud in Sinai and Kirbet el-Kam in Judah describe Asherah as the wife of Yahweh. The Elephantine papyri, which I mentioned in my video on Joseph, show that the Canaanite goddess Anat was still venerated centuries later alongside Yahweh and other Canaanite deities by the Israelite diaspora in Egypt. Canaanite sacred stones and open-air shrines also feature prominently in the patriarchal narratives, and Hosea 3:4 suggests that living without sacrifices and sacred stones was divine punishment for Israel. The verses shown here mention Massabot in a neutral or positive context. Numerous excavations show the existence of Massabot at Israelite and Judahite sites, including a pair of sacred stones at an Israelite temple at Arad that may have represented Yahweh and Asherah. Israelite archaeological sites are also littered with religious idols and figurines in the thousands. A detailed look at the gods and goddesses of the Bible and Israelite folk religion is beyond the scope of this video, but it's clear that Israelite religious practices, including those that some biblical authors disapproved of, were simply a continuation of Bronze Age Canaanite religion. If anything was unique about the religion of the Sumerian and Judahite monarchies, it was their adoption of Yahweh as their national deity. And it appears that even Yahweh had Canaanite origins, for 2 ancient Egyptian inscriptions associate that name with a nomadic Canaanite tribe called the Shasu during the late Bronze Age. However, the story of Yahweh's origins and how he became Israel's God will have to wait for another video. These facts raise an interesting problem. If, as the evidence shows us, the Israelites were themselves a Canaanite people, why do parts of the Bible show such unrestrained hostility toward the Canaanites and their religion? The Pentateuch and historical books look back at the fall of Samaria and Judah as past events, and accordingly they must be dated to the exile or post-exilic period. So it is after the exile that we must search for a real-world situation that could have provoked these negative attitudes. Perhaps it was due in part to the opposition that Jewish returnees faced when they left Babylon and tried to reclaim Jerusalem as their rightful home. The Canaanites in these stories are not the Bronze Age Canaanites of history, but a literary prop used to contextualize the struggles of Israelites many centuries later.
Do you remember the good years in Canaan? The summers were endlessly gold.
Mais oui!
The fields were a patchwork of clover.
I love it!